And I am very happy to welcome you to the Flagstaff 3.5% project. I'm Sandra Lubarski, and I'm the president of Flagstaff College. The 3.5% project is sponsored by Flagstaff College in Flagstaff, Arizona, and we are a new, innovative micro college offering a single major on sustainability and social change, and preparing students to contribute to a livable future. You can check us out at our webpage, www.flagstaffcollege.education. We're also happy to have as our co-sponsor the Center for Process Studies in Salem, Oregon. CPS promotes a paradigm for planetary flourishing based in a process relational understanding of reality. Our theme for this series is, what am I called to do? Cultivating an active heart in community with others. Our goal is to understand the power we have individually and the power we have together to make social change happen. The 3.5% project gets its name from the 3.5% rule of thumb, which is the idea that serious change can happen when 3.5% of the population is involved in making it happen. Sustaining those changes takes more people, and that's why we need participation in robust political and democratic systems. But 3.5% of the population has the power it takes to disrupt damaging and dangerous power relations. Our most damaging and dangerous relations today, as you all know, center on global climate change and the tremendous ecological turmoil and social injustices following from it. CO2 in the atmosphere now measures 419 parts per million. That's a new record high, and it's in spite of the economic slowdown occasioned by COVID-19. And that is 69 parts per million above the target goal of 350 parts per million set by climate scientists. With climate change, every 10th of a degree matters. What we do now matters. We know that the actions of others influence the decisions we make in our own lives. Recent psychological studies confirm that when we witness moral excellence, we are more inclined to act virtuously in our own lives. It's important to give our attention to good examples. And tonight, we have two inspiring individuals whose work motivates us to do the work that needs doing. I do want to give a special shout out before we get started to Nora Timmerman and the students at Northern Arizona University who are joining us tonight. They're participating in a climate teach-in on the NAU campus. And now I'm going to introduce Mark Ford, who is the co-founder of Flagstaff College, and he'll introduce our speakers. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, and welcome. It's such a pleasure to see you all and to introduce to you two wonderful human beings who are also climate activists. I'm going to introduce tonight's speakers in reverse order. Arte Romero y Carver is an artist, a poet, and a grassroots organizer. She's co-founder of YUCCA, Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, and the recipient of numerous awards, including the David Brower Youth Award. And she's a freshman in college. Old people often, sometimes apologetically, look to the young to solve the problems of the world. This is grossly unfair. And yet the problems that we face are so big that it'll take all of us working together to make a difference. And young people have a unique contribution to make, but they can't do it alone, and we can't do it without them. Arte, thank you so much for being here with us tonight and reminding us of the role that young people can and must play in addressing the climate crisis that they did not create. Tim DeChristopher is also here, and we couldn't be more pleased. Tim's greatest contribution to the fight to stave off the worst consequences of the climate crisis, in my estimation, is its clear articulation that the climate crisis is a moral crisis and that we are morally obligated to act. Technologists, politicians, corporations, and billionaires will not and cannot save us. They have a minor role to play, but the major role belongs to us, all of us. And it sometimes involves working outside the law that favors the status quo, which is to say disaster. Tim is now working with the Climate Disobedience Center, the CDC, an organization he co-founded dedicated to nonviolent civil disobedient projects, such as stopping coal trains, blocking pipeline construction, and shutting off the valves of pipelines carrying Canadian oil to the United States. We are privileged to have this opportunity to learn from him and to thank him so much for not just being here tonight, but for all of the good work he's been doing on our behalf for the last 15 years. So thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks to Marcus and Sandra for inviting me into this conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight. I'm joining here from my new home in far down east Maine in Pembroke, which is in Passamaquoddy territory. It is also known as Sunrise County because it's the farthest east point of the United States, and it's also exactly halfway between the equator and the North Pole. And we're right here on the shores of the Cobscook Bay, which has is known for its huge tides of 24 vertical feet that rise and fall every 6 hours, and that massive constant change and huge liminal spaces that go back and forth between underwater and out in the air makes for a rich diversity of life in that coastal zone. And I'm out here farming now at a really interesting permaculture saltwater farm, and like pretty much everywhere else in the world that still has an intact, healthy ecosystem, there's always a corporation chomping at the bit to try to extract those resources. So at the same time that I'm farming out here, I'm also fighting off a polymetallic sulfide mine proposal from a Canadian mining company that wants to hopefully extract some silver just a couple miles upstream from this farm in our very shallow aquifer. So we're organizing the community to fight that off, as many other places are fighting off extraction as well. So that's what my life is looking like now, which is very different than a lot of the other chapters of my life geographically, where I've bounced around the country a lot over the past 12 years or so, and also just in terms of my own work, which has kind of drifted away from a lot of the direct action and civil disobedience that I was doing a decade or so ago. During that time, after I got out of prison, I went to Harvard Divinity School and did focus more on kind of how we spiritually and emotionally grapple with this unprecedented crisis, and what it really means for us on a human level, and how we hold on to our humanity as we go through this period of disruption and chaos that we're on track for. spent a little time working as a hospital chaplain after that. Then became a massage therapist, and for several years spent that was my primary income. Work was working as a massage therapist. Spent a while working on a farm in Rhode Island, and now working on a farm here in Maine. So I've done a lot of different things. I've continued some of my activism, as Marcus said. I've spent some time blocking some coal trains up here in New England as part of a campaign to shut down the last coal-fired power plant in New England. It's in southern New Hampshire, and have worked with lots of other folks that engaged in a lot of civil disobedience around that campaign. So I've kind of always been looking for my own role in this work, and seeing that as constantly evolving, and also just kind of looking for my own place. I was sitting around a campfire last night with somebody who was asking me about Wendell Berry, and I found myself talking about just how jealous I am of his sense of place and his sense of rootedness, that I have lacked for most of my life since my family left West Virginia when I was a kid, knowing that it was not a place with much of a future for kids growing up there, which was why my parents got us out of there. And ever since I've bounced back and forth across the country, looking for a place that could feel like home again. And I think that's given me a bit of perspective and insight on something that I think is becoming more and more a part of our reality of not just climate disruption, but the socio-political disruption and economic disruption that we're seeing here and around the world, where more and more people are forced to leave their homes and start over for one reason or another, whether that's wildfires that drive them away, or droughts that make their homes unlivable, or wars of aggression for the last drops of resources. So this is for me a kind of difficult time to say that I have anything figured out. But I'm also really grateful for the journey that I've had as an activist, and for that ability to float around. I came into this work with a pretty clear critique of professional activism, that in some ways I inherited from my mother, who was fighting the coal companies in the early days of mountaintop removal when I was growing up in West Virginia, but got out of that work when it became professionalized and removed from the grassroots. And so coming into it with that critique, I kind of studiously avoided ever becoming a professional activist, which I'm still to this day grateful for, because while I see that work as important in a lot of ways, I also see how easy it is to get trapped into that little activist subculture, which is often very toxic and often a little bubble that burns people out because it pits people against one another, but it also, I think, makes people more detached from the physical world, the more than human world around them, and the human world around them as well. And you know, I've found myself continually drawn to doing physical work at the same time that I'm doing this kind of intangible work of working for deep cultural change, um, and you know, not only working on, you know, changing policy, but also really changing the spiritual way that we relate to the world and our place in it. You know, at the same time that I'm kind of keeping one hand or one foot into that world of that really slow, intangible change, where it often feels like we're not making any progress, you know, for years at a time of doing that work. At the same time, I keep one foot and one hand into something physical and tangible, where I'm using my body, and I think that to me has been really critical to maintaining my own sanity, is not just connecting to people with my words, but connecting to the earth with my body, doing farming work, and connecting to other human beings silently and physically with my hands as a massage therapist. You know, it was actually really transformative for me to get into massage therapy after years as an activist. I found it really easy to be very critical of a lot of people in our society, and really judgmental, and also feel really alienated from them, you know, and feel like I, you know, maybe didn't have much in common with a lot of people and that sort of thing. And that's definitely sort of an activist trope. You know, I am in a lot of activist spaces where people sort of celebrate, like, oh, you know, most people wouldn't understand us, or most people don't get this. It's kind of celebrating that alienation. But one of the most powerful things for me as a massage therapist was that almost every single client that I ever worked on, I was able to feel a really strong and genuine sense of compassion for them, just with silently connecting to them. And it really gave me like a much more positive view on humanity and on our future, and in my own place in sort of the human community, of not feeling quite so isolated and disconnected from a lot of the folks that, you know, would never show up in any sort of activist space. And that was really powerful for me. And you know, even on people that I knew were my opponents or enemies. When I was working at a fancy spa in Boulder, Colorado, I found myself massaging an executive for CSX Railroad, which was the company that pushed really hard to put me back in prison. At just about a year earlier, they had gotten the local authorities to charge me with a felony that carried a potential 20-year sentence. And he was a pretty high up executive in that. You know, I was still able to feel a sense of connection and compassion for him. And certainly didn't tell him who I was. But you know, for me, the having more of a holistic way of living, and kind of less of a boundary between what I see as activist work and what I see as the rest of my life, and the rest of how I engage as a human being, has kind of what has kept me grounded and able to keep moving forward in doing this work, even during very trying times. So that's kind of where I'm at and where I've been for the past decade or so. And with that, I'll open it up for the rest of the conversation.
Thanks so much, Tim, for giving us that update, that personal update, and that advice, that wonderful way of imagining how this work, how to do this work and how to continue the work that you've done. I wonder, before we turn to Arte, if you could just say a little bit more about that struggle that I think so many people are having, the word spiritual and emotional that you used. And if you can talk about that. I mean, you do talk about grounding yourself, literally grounding yourself in order to be able to attend to those dimensions. But what about the spiritual dimension of this work and the moral dimension as well?
Yeah, you know, when I used to give a lot of talks about climate change, 12 years ago or so, people would inevitably ask me, like, what's the one most important thing that you think we should all be doing? And my answer was always to grieve, that we need to mourn the world that we're losing, the opportunity and potential that we are closing down for the future, and so much of what we love about the world that is threatened. We need to grieve that so that we'll have the strength to move forward as we face this tremendous loss that we're on track for. And now I feel like we're at a point where that's sinking into more and more people. More and more people are feeling that loss. Some people are feeling it with eyes wide open, of seeing that this is loss from climate change. This is loss from the consequences of our overconsumption. And I think some people are feeling it without understanding it, and just feeling this deep insecurity, and feeling like, oh, something is threatening me, and I think that's why so many people are so open to demagogues who step in and say, if you're feeling this insecurity, it's those people that are stealing your entitlement from you. It's those people that you should be scared of and take it out on them. So I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, but connecting to the inevitability of that loss, to me is critical of facing the mortality of our civilization, is as critical to sustaining this work as facing our own individual mortality is critical to being fully alive and fully embracing our temporary time here with gratitude, and living life to the fullest. We have to recognize that that it won't last, in order to fully appreciate what we really have here, and really love those around us. And I think the same is true on a larger level. And for me, the grieving has always made the connection stronger, and the love for what is being lost stronger. And to me, that's the spiritual work that is involved in being alive and awake at this time.
It may be, it may seem, I've heard very clearly what you said, so that I just want to say that before I ask you this next question, and because it may seem like a disjunction, but I was struck in the, when you were interviewed or talking with Terry Tempest Williams years ago, that about hope, and you said, and so this is a question about hope in light of grief, but you said, I have a lot of hope in my generation's ability to build a better world in the ashes of this one, and I have very little doubt that we'll have to. But then you went on and said, it's somewhat comforting to know that things are going to fall apart, because it does give us that opportunity to drastically change things. And I'm wondering if you still, if that still captures where you are, that kind of dialectic between the disaster that we're facing and yet the hope that's possible.
I can't say that I do still have that. That hope in our ability to build something better. You know, for me, the cultural direction of our society over the past 10 or 12 years has been often more discouraging to me than the acceleration of climate change, which I think I had kind of readied myself for to a greater degree. Yeah, and I mean, not with the people that not just with the people that I politically disagree with. Yeah, it's been disheartening to me to see where we've gone culturally, and I think some of that is influenced by the tech industry really like colonizing people's minds. But even in activist cultures, I have just been really discouraged to see the pettiness and toxicity within activist spaces. And yeah, I don't have a lot of hope or optimism at this point, but still feel compelled to keep doing the work of trying to build a better world and holding on and loving this one.
That is a tough place to be, to do the work without hope at your side. I do see that Lynn DeJong has asked, someone else writes in, I feel the same way. And Lynn says, what would make you hopeful again? And I want to raise that question in terms of, as we move to Arte, who is much younger now, more the age, closer to the age you were when you were bitter 70. And I think it'd be helpful to hear what do you say to Arte's generation?
I think there's a lot of ways to understand hope, or to think about it. And I've always resisted the idea of like what we can say to give someone hope, or what other things can do to give me hope. um, that hope isn't really given, in my opinion. That it, um, you know, I like the next comment on there about hope through action. That to me, hope is more like the calluses on your hands. Like it's what helps sustain the work that needs to be done. It's what helps sustain you to get up and keep moving forward every day, and to hold on to your values. And that comes from doing it, you know, that you know, you don't wait to pick up the shovel until you have calluses on your hand. You know, the calluses come from doing the work. And to me, hope is like that.
Well, I think that's a great statement that I'm going to write down and post on our next newsletter, that you don't wait to pick up the shovel till you have calluses on your hands. But before we turn to Arte, actually, I would like to hear you speak, if you don't mind, about love, because that seems to me to be the word that has been more central in your work, rather than hope.
Yeah. To me, that is the root of the motivation, and has been from the beginning for me, you know. And when you know, 15 years ago or so, you know, when I was really getting into the work of climate change, you know, it was in part because I felt a much more loving connection to the community around me, but I was also spending a lot of time building a relationship with people in the future, and you know, developing a real love for those who would come after me. And it was that imaginative kind of relationship building with those who expected me to be a good ancestor for them, that was the loving relationship that I felt was really driving me to action. And it was also just the gratitude that I felt for the world that I loved around me, and the people who had helped me really appreciate that world and develop a relationship with it. You know, I grew up in really close relationship to the earth, to the mountains, and was really grateful for the gifts that I felt like I received from that relationship. And yeah, when you love something, you hold on to it, you fight for it.
That's great. Oh, yeah, Sandra muted herself, but Arte.
No, yeah. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to transition over to hear Arte and your, you know, what you're doing, what motivates you, you know, what help we can be to the work that you're doing. It's all yours to tell us what you're doing.
So I can give a little bit of context about who I am and answer some of those questions. And I guess I can give like my opinions on hope. Before that, I have a short poem that I can share with y'all. I thought it would be, it's a little self-indulgent, but I also thought it would be nice to start with a poem. It's not necessarily more hopeful. So like, apologies for that. I think we're spiraling down a little bit. Ideally, we'll rise a little bit before we end. The poem is called "The Moments When You Calculate Projected Lifespan." It's about a event in New Mexico following one of the first sit-ins I ever attended. Catching Kansas fireflies with my little cousin, with the fireworks behind us, with the combined effect of a peripheral wall of tiny lights, a peripheral wall of state police officers that followed us here like younger siblings, but with guns, into this old Spanish church, a rounded mud settlement filled into a cathedral, made into an art museum, now made and in a real way returned to a government building. An end result, among many, is a mural celebrating colonization. The choir of conquistadors in iron and irony behind a white cabinet secretary lying about fracking. We shout true things, which in turn make others shout similar things, and the volume is flooding as a ploy. They give a toddler a microphone. She is probably the same age as my cousin. She talks about trees, school, and extinction. The secretary is deafeningly earnest. Yeah, the moments when you calculate projected lifespans. That was one of the first things that like got me. I don't know. We talk about hope. I started out relatively pessimistic. I don't think like it's not quite that I'm like young and idealistic and then I've been refined into a position of cynicism over the years. I think I started out pretty cynical. The cynicism is what kept me politically inactive for a number of years. I think, I had a relatively quick political education as a child. So you give a little bit of background. My father is from like East Coast wealth, like WASP, East Coast wealth. My mother is norteña, if any of you know that term, but Chicana from northern New Mexico. They married mostly to piss off their respective parents. But as a product of that marriage and like existing, they divorced pretty soon afterwards either. So they got the kicks out of the marriage. But because of that, they divorced early. And I found myself going between my father's world and my mother's world intermittently. And my father is kind of does a level of like self-imposed poverty. He teaches art. He went to art school, all of the things that someone born to wealth can do for the sake of class tourism. My mother, the opposite. Especially when I was a child, my mother was, our experience was, there's a different kind of poverty. And I bounced between those worlds, and it left me with questions about like, why are these cousins going to private school and why are these cousins in jail? And so pretty quickly I was given, I think, introducing Karl Marx book. And so I got some level of class analysis. To clarify, I don't identify as a communist anymore. I was for a short period of time a very vehement communist in maybe 7th grade, but time has passed me. But I had these questions, and to me, the distinctions between it wasn't that my mother's family was more violent; they were jailed more. It was to do with race and class distinction, and so that became pretty clear to me. And then you work out from there, and I don't think I had any faith in the government. I don't know that I do today either, but I didn't have it when I was younger. There wasn't a lot of idealism to be shattered, but it was like that lack of idealism, the sense that in the face of the United States government, in the face of American occupation, I didn't have a high school degree, a high school diploma. I didn't think I could be useful. I felt alone and useless. The thing that made me first consider climate change, I did debate in high school, which is essentially like competitive assholery. And excuse my language. And part of the point of high school debate is people throw citations at each other. So I was preparing for the debate meet, and I was trying to find some citations to throw. It's a deeply depersonal way to interact with politics. It's arguably terrible, but I was looking for citations, and I found one report, and it's somewhere on my desktop. I keep it around, but without getting into it, it's like projected. It's a very scientific name, but it reads like apocryphal text, or it reads like apocalyptic text. It describes like the potential collapse of civilization by 2050. It describes like heat waves and unlivable conditions. It describes scientifically projected, and this was maybe 5 years ago, scientifically projected world of 2050, and that's an apocalyptic world. And the worst part of that is I did the math, and I said, okay, how old am I? 2050, how much time do I have left? And once you start doing that math, you can't stop doing it for other people. You know, you meet your cousin and she's younger than you, right? She's like, what, I was 16 at that point, so maybe she's 8. And you do the math, and that's another, wow, I can't do 16 minus 8. That, you know, but that's even less years that she has. Yeah, you meet anyone younger than yourself and you immediately feel guilty. You meet anyone older than yourself and you feel maybe jealous, but not really. It's not that much better for anyone else. So yeah, that's where I was in my life. Junior year, no, sophomore year of high school. I was fully cynical, fully terrified, and I wasn't doing anything.
Arte, I hate to interrupt you, but some people are having a difficult time hearing you. Can you speak
my
closer
apologies.
to the mic there?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Is this any better too? I can hold one of the microphones in my hand.
I'll give it a try.
Okay, I'll also just move this closer. Anyway, also I tend to talk a little quietly. I've also snuck into a mock trial forum. There's a little whole court setup there. So I'm trying to be discreet. I don't want anyone to notice that I'm not in fact a law student. The point is, I started off very pessimistic. Someone invited me at the end of like an anatomy course that I was failing to attend a city council meeting to kind of pass some acknowledgement on a city level of the Green New Deal. So very minimal policy, right? But she was a friend. She had been kind to me before. I didn't have anything else going on. It was like a Tuesday afternoon, so I went. And I still had the fear that, like, you know, reading the scientific articles had created in me. So when she asked me to prepare like a 1-minute speech along with these other people who were doing 1-minute speeches, I felt pretty confident in doing that. Then I went up there and I gave my speech. I don't think it was a very good speech. I've definitely given better speeches after. I think it was, if anything, just very direct. I think I kept repeating that I was scared. And I gave that speech and it felt fine. I don't know if I saw any recognition on the eyes of the politicians I was speaking to. But after I gave that speech, another person came after me, another young person came after me and gave a speech, and another person, and another person, and another person. And we kind of filled up that whole agenda item until they didn't let anyone else speak. And they invited me, that group of people, to attend another meeting. And that snowballed. And the reason I attended that next meeting was because I was still scared. I wasn't necessarily any less scared, but I was less alone. And I would much prefer to be scared and united than scared and alone. And so that group of people introduced me to some other people, and some of those people started attending with me these meetings. And from those meetings, we started an organization in the fall of 2019 called YUCCA, Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, which has developed into a C4 nonprofit. C4 means that we can directly lobby politicians. C4 nonprofit called YUCCA, Youth United for Climate Crisis Action. And I've since gone to college, but the nonprofit still operates. And our work has always been to address the intersection of race and environment, and specifically deal with environmental racism in the state of New Mexico, where so much oil extraction happens. I think a lot of you all are in Arizona, so you're pretty close to the Permian Basin, and also the Four Corners area, where some of the most extraction, some of the cheapest oil fields in the world are held. Yeah, so that's been that. Did lobbying for a while, environmental lobbying for YUCCA. Now I'm in college. That was a poem. That was my biography. Those are the two stories I usually tell about my childhood. I don't know. I think the question was like around hope, right? I know that there was a bigger point that I was supposed to get to. Um, hmm.
You know, I would be interested. Tell me what's going on. You're at Washington University. Is there, are there students? I mean, one way of thinking about college is it's a way to kind of prepare yourself for the future, and usually in economic professional terms, as if the world is going on in more or less the same form that it's gone on for the last 50 years. And you're investing in yourself, you're investing in your career. Um, that I think that's a very common way of thinking about higher education today. Um, but there's always been,
connection to God. So it makes sense that you would make fun of things that are of God.
I didn't hear that. Any rate, I'm just curious, what's your sense for what kinds of things are going on at that university? And are you plugged into those things, or are you still mainly working with things back in Santa Fe?
So I don't know, for me, like I already kind of had, college was a strange choice for me. I already kind of had like some level of professional life. I wasn't really attending high school by the time I was graduating high school. I had gotten enough things qualified as internships, and I was working full time for my last semester. And like policy advocacy, we had the New Mexico legislative session at the very end of my senior year. COVID made it a lot easier to kind of wander into adulthood prematurely. That's also kind of what's required too from environmental organizing, right? There's a in looking to children to solve environmental crisis. There's like an adultification. I used to call myself a child lobbyist. Which I thought was a little funny. The reason I came to college was to like have someone finance my ability to live in a new place and learn from people. And learn especially new tactics of resistance. And I've been really honored to meet organizers in St. Louis and start to learn some of those tactics. Okay, let me lay out my little strategy here. I am going to make an appeal to hope before we end. I feel not just like obligated to do it, but like personally, I'd like to. But I also want to agree, I mean, with Tim, in terms of like the current state of the American environmental movement. I came to WashU, and I think I've had very vivid experience of the state of that movement. In New Mexico, I'd say we are we tend to succeed in some of the ways that the larger American environmental movement hasn't. In St. Louis, especially the college organizing spaces, I actually wrote a paper specifically on how much I disagreed with the tactics of some of the organizing here, and not specifically, but it was part of it. So, for example, WashU has an incredible investment in oil and gas. WashU was like a 13 billion. WashU is the university I'm attending, by the way, Washington University in St. Louis. It has an endowment of 13 billion. A portion of that money is in oil and gas revenue. And there's been work to divest. I've worked before with like Divested in Boston, and I am trained in divestment organizing. But when I got here, I encountered like a severely weakened divestment movement, which, one of the ways in which they were weakened is that, I'll be direct with you. One of the largest issues with the American environmental movement is that it has been built in such a way that it treats issues of race as essentially secondary to the goals of environmentalism. And because of that, it doesn't fully appreciate the evil of the forces it is fighting. And I think it estimates much greater, especially, a lot of the movement is young white people newly from college. It really overestimates the humanity of both the state and private sector. And in doing so, it makes appeals that are not very focused, they're not very clear demands, and they're reliant on some level of trust. You can look at the Sunrise Movement and the way that they failed to really get the goals that they wanted out of Biden's presidency from him. And also the way that they faltered after they didn't listen. They fired one of their head graphic designers and one of the leading Black members of Sunrise executive team And because of that, for example, there was a Sunrise Hub in St. Louis. It is no longer a Sunrise Hub. And we're kind of seeing that nationally. YUCCA at one point, we're registered as a Sunrise Hub, but it actually didn't benefit us with the communities we were working with to align ourselves with Sunrise and their national organization. One of the biggest issues I've had is that environmentalism is seen as a strictly white cause. And that's because the space of environmentalism has been so far held by white people, but not even just by white people, but specifically by upper class, college educated white Americans who treat the cause of like conservatism as unrelated to, say, land theft or segregation. But the actual reality of pollution is that pollution is almost predicated on the poisoning of a specific racial ethnic minority. You can look at like, you know, the very initial like Bullard's writing on climate justice. And so that's in my view, the way in which the environmental movement in the US, it is not nearly, it doesn't appreciate how uphill a battle it is fighting. And because of that, it doesn't nearly enough use tactics of civil disobedience and disruption. It is a very electoralist movement in many ways, and that is to our detriment. So I was just looking at someone's chat statement. So I know that wasn't very hopeful, right? It's maybe the opposite. My point is though, is I do agree with Tim. Not just on the American right, but culturally, the social, we don't have the conceptual framework that's popularized enough to be confronting the issue of climate change, because it is an issue that is based in integral problems in our society that won't be solved by the specific electoral passage of the Green New Deal. So that's the hopelessness. I can talk a little bit about hope. So part of the reason I'm so upset about electoralism at the moment is I spent my senior year working lobbying during the New Mexico legislative session, and I kind of went all in on electoralism as like a young person, because I thought, even if we weren't going to have substantial victories, we could still have some victories. Objectively, there had never been a more important time for the New Mexico legislative body to take environmental action. Like California was burning, Texas was having its power outages. Our last legislative session, some of the least environmental policy work was done in like recent years. And I did what I could, and I believe I tried my best. And we passed some laws, we passed community solar. But generally, we were hoping for so much more, and we got less than the least of our expectations. So I left high school, and I left kind of that electoral work very hopeless, very tired. Two things happened that made me get over my regained pessimism. The first one was I attended a poetry screening during COVID. There's not a lot of open mics. I do spoken word poetry. There weren't a lot of open mics, but a friend who worked with a production company wanted to take usually their theater project and turn it into a recording of spoken word poets, make it a movie. So I got together some young people from our community. We recorded some stuff. I listened to myself perform the poetry when we did the screening. I don't know. I don't like seeing myself on camera. I feel like there can only be one of me, and I don't want to be around the second one. But I did really enjoy seeing like 4 or 5 different people from our community. And a lot of our stuff ended up, even if it wasn't explicitly about climate change or even explicitly about race, it was almost always about like joy. And as a product of being shown during COVID, it was about like joy. I mean, we're still during COVID, but it was inherently just like the context of when I watched it, it was about joy in the face of like profound grief, like the right to joy. And I cried a little bit. And I don't know, seeing young people from our community be happy, kind of despite everything. Like, I think a lot of hope is actually about bravery. It's not about evaluating the circumstance and finding the cause to feel hope. It's about deciding that you will be hopeful, and deciding that you will have the bravery to trust in something that might not happen, that your joy might not be then you might not have cause for your joy, but you'll still have it. And then the other thing that happened, I got to WashU, and there was a protest around something that I won't get into, but it was a small protest. And we showed up at the dean's lawn. And also during that last year, when I hadn't been doing electoral work and I'd been organizing in New Mexico, I'd witnessed, and I don't want to say anything specific, but I'd seen police and I'd heard police do some things that had made me increasingly afraid of the state and increasingly afraid of police officers in a way I'd never really been before, maybe naively. But, and I still had those memories in my head when we were protesting in front of the dean's office or the chancellor's house. There's a big house on campus. The chancellor lives there. I don't know what a chancellor is. I guess it's fancier than a dean, but we were there. Where it was very fancy. It was very chancellor-esque. And there's maybe 16 kids, around 16 police officers showed up. Someone had asked me to hold a megaphone. And the person who was speaking on the megaphone, I was holding the little box so that it makes sound. I wasn't contributing very much, but the person who was speaking was getting closer and closer to his door. And she was, I know her now. I won't say her name, but she's from St. Louis. She's a really brave environmental organizer. And she was getting closer and closer to the dean's, to the chancellor, I'm sorry, the chancellor's door. And there's this wall of police officers around us. And she asks me, well, are you willing to go up on the steps? And I'm like, well, are you going to? And she's like, yes. And I was like, okay, then I will. And she did. And she didn't like flinch. She didn't even look at them. When she got up on the steps to speak, she passed through the, I mean, when police officers make a wall, it's usually with the threat of violence, right? You know, line everyone up so that people can walk between you. But she did, she walked between them. And then I did, because she had, and because if she was brave enough to do that, then of course I would be able to. I wasn't even saying anything. Yeah. We ended up leaving a little bit. We left some stuff, some like signs in front of his lawn. We got out of there as more police officers came. But I don't know. I think if my argument is that bravery is about, or that hope is about bravery, then also a source of bravery is the bravery of others, and the bravery of others is a source of hope. And so I don't necessarily have to always have a reason to hope, but I try to find people who are braver than me. And they usually provide that. And that's what I've been able to find in St. Louis, at least. Maybe not a good environmental movement, but a few really brave people. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Arte. I actually want to ask you and Tim both to reflect for a minute on this phrase that comes from Terry Tempest Williams, and it's about the meaning of an active heart. And when I heard that phrase, I was very struck by that. I think it's a powerful image that we should have active hearts. And I think it connects both the activism work with what Tim was talking about, this need to be compassionate. And I'm wondering just how you react to that idea of having an active heart, and your advice for, or your reflection on how you've cultivated that in yourself.
Tim, if you want to take it, I rambled for a while recently, so I'll hand it over. Oh, I think you're muted.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, as I was saying earlier, I felt like it was my heart that drove me into action, like my love and concern for the people in the world around me, that drove me into action. And then I think I kind of got caught up in the action for a while, and caught up in my own momentum and the momentum of the movement of people around me, and didn't maintain the heart in it as well. And had a lot of people like encourage me to bring more of my heart back into the work. Actually got to the point that even my chiropractor told me I should lead with my heart and not my head. And he actually meant it a little more literally. But that image of like bringing my heart as like propelling me forward into the work became more of a guide for me after that, that it has to be kind of this balance between that inner work of listening to our hearts, like being in touch with our hearts, both the grieving and the gratitude of like holding both of that, and the outer work of actually taking action. You know, I used to be rather skeptical of folks who would express great love for people and the planet in flowery language, but not be willing to stand up and fight to defend it. You know, I always felt like if you love something, how can you not be driven into action? And so to me, those two things have to go hand in hand, that internal work and external work. And I often talk about the idea of like riding a bicycle, where the internal work is like getting your balance, and the external work of taking action is like pedaling and getting your forward momentum. And if you try to balance your bike perfectly before you start pedaling, you'll never go anywhere, because you'll always be wobbling a little bit. You can always like fine tune your balance. But if you just pedal and ride without worrying about balance at all, you'll crash and get hurt pretty soon. But the two actually support one another. The forward momentum aids the balance, and the balance sustains the forward momentum. And to me, the heart work and the action work out in the world are that same way. That if we just focus on our own heart and our own emotions, our own internal world, and try to like get that right for us to then go out and engage with the world, we never get to that point of engagement, because it's the action that helps to heal the heart and make the heart whole, because we are not just isolated individuals. Our nature is that we are interdependent and deeply interconnected with all the rest of the life in the world. And so we need that action and that connection and engagement with the work, the outer work, to be done in order for that inner work to really sustain itself as well.
That was just beautiful. And that image of bicycle riding is so perfect. I wonder, before we leave, I'd like to have, Tim, I'd love to hear what you would how you would respond to Arte, who said this idea of looking to children to solve climate change. And Arte, it seemed to me you said that with some disdain. And Tim, I'm wondering what you would say to Arte in regard to that.
I mean, it's obviously unfair, because the very nature of climate change is violence against the young. Climate change is a form of intergenerational injustice and intergenerational violence. And I think that's complicated because our other forms of injustice across boundaries are much more fixed. Like when we talk about structural racism and racial violence and racial injustice, you know, my white skin doesn't change. I'm always on that one side of that racial dynamic. But you know, I'm no longer a young person. Like I no longer speak about that that intergenerational violence of climate change as someone, you know, primarily on the receiving end as a young person. I'm 40 years old, and the 40 years that I've had on this planet have been in a much more privileged period of time where I've been able to enjoy a lot of blessings and comfort in my 40 years that I know people coming up in the next 40 years are not going to enjoy. And so, you know, it's a weird kind of like privilege and oppression where we are transitioning constantly, all of us. You know, all of us now alive are enjoying a privilege that will come at the expense of those who will come after us. And now at this point, like all of us are experiencing negative consequences that comes from the impact of the overconsumption of those who came before us. You know, so I've always wondered why young people weren't more enraged at their elders with the nature of the climate crisis. You know, in terms of the climate movement that makes itself seen, I've seen youth anger kind of ebb and flow over the years. Sometimes it seems more central. Sometimes young people seem like a little more uncomfortable with at least expressing any anger. But yeah, it's very complicated territory, you know, and like often when I've spoken about like the intergenerational aspect of this, it's difficult for folks to hear because it can be really like far more sensitive than a lot of other things that we talk about for some reason. But it's just very complex. And you know, I know that all the older folks that are engaged on the climate crisis deeply love younger people, like deeply love the younger people in their lives and deeply love younger people in general, and that's what drives them into this work. You know, and yet it's still very hard, I think, to be a young person and making sense both of the crisis itself that has been dumped on your future and the way that people talk about it and put expectations on you. You know, when, like, particularly the way I heard old folks talk about Greta Thunberg, I just felt so sorry for her all the time. Like, it was the amount of like hero projection, you know, onto a 16-year-old was just so hard to watch. You know, like it was a far greater amount of hero projection than was ever directed towards me when I was in my late 20s in that role. And I found that projection to be more than I could handle when I was in that position. It felt really unhealthy for me. You know, so I can't imagine what it felt like to be in her position. And yeah, as the stakes go up, all this just gets tougher. Sorry.
Right. And Arte, go ahead and respond.
I appreciate that, Tim. I mean, when I had a little poem at the beginning, and it was about an event that was protesting, and the police had followed us there because of a sit-in that was happening at the governor's office. And the sit-in, it was like maybe 12 people that were arrested, and they were all kind of over the age of 50. They were people who had kind of come to the decision, like especially older white people, come to the decision that because of their age, they felt that they wanted to take a risk for our movement, and they did. And I really appreciated that. I mean, yeah, I think the rage is tricky. You're talking about like, what does love do for movement organizing? I'm gonna get slightly dry just for a second. I came to college in part to understand, like, to get access to the academic resources, et cetera, to like see movement data, right? And see like what is actually happening empirically, and like what do, movement studies, social movement studies is a subdivision of sociology in a lot of American institutions. Social movement studies as like discipline, I have a brief overview of it. I know I want to claim any expertise, but from what I've been told, some of the predicating factors around movement success, have to do with like political opportunity, shared political grievance, political and structural resources, which include both like literal resources and then also like the amount of connection in a given community before organizing, scale of escalation, the way that you frame events. That's all of the Josh stuff. Very recently, one of the more cutting edge sociological social movement theories is emotion theory. And I found that really funny when I learned it. It's highly controversial. It's very new, but there's the idea that emotions may impact how people behave. That's one of the new kind of cutting edge theories that sociology has produced. And I don't know, I found that interesting to me because I think that was one of the first things that I was taught when I got into movement spaces, was firstly, the anger is good. The anger is righteous. Keep the anger. But people don't really stay angry for that long. Or if you stay angry for a really long time, you're keeping something gross inside you. Anger is not a permanent condition. Love is a little more withstanding. I'd like to think love is a little more withstanding. And I mean, on one level, I do think that there should be greater willingness on the part of my generation to display righteous anger, not necessarily across the line of generation, but righteous anger at the state and the private sector that have so utterly failed us. But I also think that like, if any movement is going to continue long enough to be viable and to achieve its goals, it has to be based around the emotional capacity of love. Audre Lorde talks about the power of the erotic, and she means erotic there in a much broader way than we typically use the word erotic. And that can mean a lot of things. That can mean like actually like emotional bonds between people as they organize. It can mean things like mutual aid, right? If you're asking communities to take risks to protest with you, you also got to feed them. You've got to make sure that they've got housing and safety. And that's something that's increasingly necessary as our social conditions become more precarious. And so I think there's very tangible ways that we can measure love. And there's also very tangible ways that love can be an effective tool of social change and is like very necessary. If you want to have hope, I don't see a way forward without the strategic use of love.
I think that's exactly right. I'm paying attention to the time, but I want to, open it up for questions from anyone for, 2 or 3 questions before we call it a night. Kayla, what's the best way to do that?
Well, Mark, actually, there is a question here from Kim, and that was to ask about the practice of collective heart. And Tim, I think this is primarily coming from the peaceful uprising. And she says, I would love to hear about that. So, Tim.
I'm actually not sure what she's referring to. Yeah, I don't.
I think Kim is here. Kim,
I am here.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, and I'm echoing like crazy. Okay, let me, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you. We can't see you.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry, we're having an echo chamber here. We have 2 computers going. Maybe I'll try to put it in the chat.
Kim, you're not echoing now if you want to talk.
Okay. No, but we're echoing here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm not. Okay, sorry. Okay, so what I'm talking about, I think, Tim, is that, and I'm really getting this from Bitter 70, not because I know anything more about peaceful uprising, but I was just so moved by the art, and I think by expressions of what I can only, I think love is the best word, between the activists involved with peaceful uprising. There was a just powerful sense of togetherness and communion around the work, around the action. So, oh, I remember, I watched the movie a little while ago, but I remember some narration while people were painting signs, for example, but also when you were about to go into the courtroom and so on and so forth. So those might be helpful examples of what I'm asking, which is, the way you talked about it was heart work is inner work and action work is outer work. And I'm asking about that dichotomy. I'm asking about collective practices of heart work in organizing.
Yeah, peaceful uprising was a really, oh, now I'm echoing. How does that happen? Yeah, peaceful uprising was a really special community. And it was like just a really loving network of people. And that is what drove a lot of our action and our success, and allowed us to push as hard as we did and take as many risks as we did, was that people really felt that love for each other and felt it as a space to bring their love for the world. And it was synergistic in that way, among those collective hearts, as you put it. So yeah, that was definitely that that collective heart space that I haven't experienced since then, and I really miss it. And I wish I understood better how to create that among a group of people. Yeah, I've been trying to rebuild that in other places and with other groups of people, and yeah, it's a challenging thing to do, to get into that like kind of synchronized heart space. But you know, when Arte said something like, I'd much rather be scared with a group of other people than scared on my own, you know, I think that to me is part of that collective heart space as well. You know, for the full range of emotions, I think is critical, you know, that you know, it's not just like what we sometimes label as like positive emotions of like the joy and the love that like are allowed into those spaces. You know, it has to be an authentic space that is really welcoming the full range of emotions that people are feeling. I think in order for people to feel like they can bring their full hearts into it.
Oh, thank you both very much. This has been wonderful. It's been sobering, but also I like to make a distinction between optimistic and hopeful. And you know, I think that the future it's hard to be optimistic. It's almost impossible to be optimistic about the future. But I do think that there are reasons to be hopeful. And I think you've both provided reasons to be hopeful, that we can come together and work together, and both inner work and outer work. But working together is so central. Working by yourself, it seems like we're doomed. There is no reason for hope or optimism if we're not united around these things that we care about. I just want to thank everybody again for coming in. We have another Zoom event in 2 weeks on April 13th, and it's focused more on local issues. Roberto Nutt-Lewis and Talia Boyd are going to be speaking about issues very close to home, uranium mining, and the destructive practices of both Indigenous people and Indigenous land close to Flagstaff. So I'm sure there'll be newsletters and emails between now and then, but I just wanted to tell you that's coming up in the future. But again, thank you both. This was terrific.
Right, and thank you everyone for being with us and for spending the time to think so deeply about these complicated issues and the complicated problems that we face, and to do it in such a heartfelt and honest way with us, Tim and Arte. We really thank you. We wish everyone a good night, and we'll see you hopefully in a couple weeks.